Okay, so we're still looking for answers. And we've heard from Father Panelo, who believes that this is divine retribution, that the plague is our fault. And specifically our fault because we have not been observing religion in the proper way. We've moved away from faith. It's, I think, useful to say that this is, as our evangelical minister for the cabinet officials suggests, this is a pretty common response. It is also a reflection of modernity and the notion that we have pulled back from religious observance, that religion no longer has the power to bind us as a culture as it once did. And this is an example that Jim Hollis uses all the time in talking about, the way the world worked, in the way that, the community was held together by a unified understanding of Christian faith in, say, 13th century Italy, when Dante Alighieri was writing the Divine Comedy. Everyone, from the Pope and the kings to the peasants, saw themselves and their place in the world in the same way. They saw themselves under, I may be misappropriating Peter Berger here, but under the same sacred canopy. Okay, and more, to a Jungian point, in the same myth. We're all part of the same sacred story. And now, certainly in the 1940s, when Camus was writing this, but in the United States in 2020, the sacred canopies are everywhere, but there's none that hangs over all of us. And there are many, many, many. And so this reaction that we need to return to a kind of religious practice that we once did is, I think, echoes another human tendency which came up actually in the discussions this week, which is that of a kind of nostalgia, a kind of fantasy about a past that once was, where things were better. And as we talked about together in the discussion, that kind of trap of nostalgia, or that kind of, again, fantasy of this imagined past where everything was all good, is a projection into the future. It actually is speaking about what we want to be, which is in a place in which we don't have to directly confront some of these really difficult questions. We want things to be easier, simpler. We want to know, we want to have a strong sense of meaning and purpose and what our role in the world is. And if it's at all possible, we want those answers to be provided for us so that we don't have to struggle with them ourselves and struggle with uncertainty, doubt, and suffering. So Panelo delivers this sermon, which makes a big impact on Oran, but maybe not the impact that he'd hoped. Taru, who is this friend of Ryu's, we met him last week. Taru is this visitor from out of town. He's staying at a 3-star hotel. He seems to be of independent means. He doesn't really seem to have much that he has to do on a day-to-day basis other than be curious. And he's writing a diary, observing his time here. And so he has this comment from his diary, which I'm going to read now. He says, "I can understand that type of fervor and find it not displeasing." He's talking about Panelo's sermon. "At the beginning of a pestilence, and when it ends, there's always a propensity for rhetoric. In the first case, habits have not yet been lost. In the second, they're returning. It is in the thick of a calamity that one gets hardened to the truth. In other words, to silence. So let's wait. One gets hardened to the truth. In other words, to silence. One gets hardened to silence." For Taru, this is the response. Rhetoric, fancy answers, are only useful to us coming into this period of crisis and coming out of it. He has a really compelling conversation with Ryu that maybe closes this passage of Camus' consideration of a traditional religious answer to the problem of human suffering. So he looks to, Teru goes to Ryu and essentially asks him, he's like, so wait a minute, so it sounds like you believe that the plague has a good side. Panelu believes that the plague has a good side, in that it is drawing us back into relationship with the divine. So he puts this to Ryu, and Ryu says, so does every ill that flesh is heir to. What's true of all the evils in the world is true of the plague as well. It helps men to rise above themselves. What does that mean? To rise above yourself. And this is a question that we're gathering questions through the course of this conversation. This is another question. How can we rise above ourselves? What does it mean to rise above oneself? So then Teru goes on and says, essentially, well, but do you believe in God? And Ryu's answer is revealing and in keeping with what we know of him so far. He says, no. But what does that really mean? I'm fumbling in the dark, struggling to make something out. But I've long ceased finding that original. So in that sentence, at least to me, and I really am looking forward to hearing your reflections on this, I hear Camus acknowledging that he doesn't know. So the difference between stating belief in God and denying the existence of God, right? And simply saying one doesn't know. And he speaks in, I think, compelling and physical language, right? So Ryu is fumbling in the dark. He's struggling to make something out. This isn't a passive, he hasn't put the question aside. This continues to be something, this continues to be a struggle he's actively engaged in, right? But he says he's long ceased finding that original. That really one's focus needs to be someplace else other than on this question of whether or not God exists. So we continue. A little bit further, Ryu has this to say about Father Panelu. He says, he hasn't come into contact with death. That's why he can speak with such assurance of the truth, with a capital T. But every country priest who visits his parishioners and has heard a man gasping for breath on his deathbed thinks as I do. He'll try to relieve human suffering before trying to point out its excellence. So a brief comment here without the video, which it looks like it just cut out briefly. I was talking about a book by Judith Herman. It's called Trauma and Recovery. It's a classic book. It came out in the 90s. And in it, she talks about the effect of witnessing human suffering on people who are doing that witnessing on a consistent basis. So she was talking about psychotherapists in this regard, but also other kinds of witnesses. And what she said is, I think, intuitive, but might shed a little bit of light on Ryu's position here, which is that being witness to human suffering can mount fundamental challenges to our basic faith. And it can create or exacerbate pessimism about the human condition. And I wouldn't say that Ryu demonstrates pessimism here, or that that's what Camus is suggesting. Camus, I think, would understand it as clear-eyed reality about the human condition, and that there's something about Panelu's position that is false because it lacks a grounding in an exposure to human suffering. So Camus has a lovely way of capturing Ryu's perspective in this moment. He says, Ryu believed himself to be on the right road in fighting against creation as he found it. And I've said before that I believe Ryu is really Camus, and this is Camus' perspective. So I would ask us in our conversations with each other and as we reflect on this text, what he might mean by that. What does he mean by fighting against creation as he finds it? The next passage that we'll read, which is the last passage from this section, might illuminate that a little bit for us. He says, "After all," the doctor repeated, then hesitated again, fixing his eyes on Taru. "It's something that a man of your sort can understand, most likely. But since the order of the world is shaped by death, mightn't it be better for God if we refuse to believe in him and struggle with all our might against death, without raising our eyes toward the heaven where he sits in silence?" Taru nodded. "Yes, but your victories will never be lasting. That's all." Ryu's face darkened. "Yes, I know that. But it's no reason for giving up the struggle." "No reason, I agree. Only I now can picture what this plague must mean for you." "Yes, a never-ending defeat." Taru stared at the doctor for a moment, then turned and tramped heavily toward the door. Ryu followed him and was almost at his side when Taru, who was staring at the floor, suddenly said, "Who taught you all this, doctor?" The reply came promptly, "Suffering." So when he says that he is fighting against creation as he found it, Ryu is fighting against, at least, human suffering. And Camus here is underlining that as a fundamental human value and motivation for human existence is to fight against suffering. And what I would suggest to you at the end of this first part is, how can we fight against suffering? I'm imagining most of us watching this are not healthcare professionals out there working on the pandemic right now. How can we fight against human suffering?